Okay, the next speaker is actually three of us from the University of Toronto Scientific Instruments. So Erich is going to introduce the collection, Ari is going to talk a little bit more about it, and I will talk specifically about the experience with the astronomical instruments. I could introduce us, but I think we're going to be doing that ourselves, so I'm going to let Erich start.
All right, thanks very much. I hope that some of you take the opportunity this afternoon to see the display of astronomical instruments that's been put together by a number of volunteers led by Paul Greenham. And if you do, what you'll see will be just a tiny fraction of the historically significant scientific material that survives at the University of Toronto. Some of it dating back to the founding of the School of Practical Science in 1878. Some, such as a few of the items in the astronomy collection, are even older. Now, a group of us, mostly grad students from the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, the IHPST, have had the privilege of working with this material. We call ourselves the University of Toronto Scientific Instrument Collection, so we're the UTSIC from the IHPST. We started up in 2008 as a pretty limited effort to deal with some clutter in our hallway at Old Vic College, and we've been growing since. Over this time, we've accomplished a few things. We've gathered a number of instruments in the cataloging room. We've worked with various collections. Physics, psychology, astronomy are some of the major ones. We started working with museum studies to bring the collection up to a more professional standard through proper paperwork, provenance research, and monitoring of the storage environment. And we've begun to build what we hope is an interesting and accessible online catalog that Ari will speak about in a moment. In doing this, we're building on the work of others who've been involved with the collection over the years, the most important of which are probably the faculty at the science departments, often emeritus professors who've saved this material from being thrown away or dispersed to other collections. People started to think about these objects around 1978 when the director of the IHPST at the time, Bruce Sinclair, first commissioned a report for a President's Advisory Committee on historic scientific instruments. This suggested that a science museum be created in the old Magnetic and Meteorological Observatory that's now in front of Hart House. The Magnetic Observatory project was the oldest scientific institution in the country, so this seemed like a perfect place to house a museum collection. But money for a renovation and a curator wasn't forthcoming, and the project died. In fact, repeated attempts to create a university-wide policy for dealing with historical scientific material, the most recent of which was in 2006, have failed to produce really any results. Graduate student efforts have been more successful, but the problem with graduate students, of course, is that they graduate. That is, unless they spend all their time dealing with old instruments. The more sophisticated a project becomes, the harder it becomes to pass on the knowledge that one accumulates to a more junior cohort of students. What's tended to happen is that when one group moves on, there's a gap of at least a few years, sometimes decades, before another group of students becomes enchanted with the collection and the process starts up again. So the best we can really do is to make the case to the university community that this material matters, and not just to people like us, historians and philosophers of science, who are trained to see the meaning and interest in the material culture of science, but to anyone remotely curious in how people in the past have approached nature. These objects are fascinating. They tell deep stories about craft traditions, aesthetic and design, scientific practices, and laboratory culture in the past. They provide a physical archive of the institutional history of science at this research university. And something we don't stress enough, we're not just interested in old instruments, the lovely glass and brass instruments we're all familiar with, but with more recent material as well, so that researchers 100 years from now won't have to deal with a substantial gap in the material record. Now, these instruments also facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue between the sciences and humanities. And I think that this is something that we've experienced in putting together the symposium. So if we or someone down the line can make these points well enough, perhaps the university will accept this material as a small but essential part of its identity as an institution.
All right, I'm just going to strip you of all your...
All right.
All right, I'm just going to hold this. That makes it easier for me. Okay, so Erich spoke a little bit about what sort of the collection is in broad terms, but I'd like to talk about what we actually do sort of as a day-to-day. The collection itself is built on instruments that are found at the University of Toronto, either stored in departments or stored in rooms like this. This is a significant portion of our present collection, is the basement of Sid Smith. When we entered this room, we saw a cockroach run out. So, like, it's actually, you know, sort of in a basement. It's damp, you know, bug infested sometimes. I'm not even going to ask about rodents and all that. So we go into places like this, and of course, this is an extreme example, but better places. For example, astronomy has a room like this. So they have a, it's cluttered, but it's not cockroach infested. No, they have actually a devoted room where people know where it is, so we don't have to look for it, which is quite nice. So go into places and sort of do one of two things. Either acquire objects into our collection physically and take the objects and move them to our storage space where we can then catalog them and you know, put them on shelves with nice foam underneath them, and hopefully not, you know, they won't be in a place where there's a million cockroaches running around. Or we can go and help people with their own rooms and try to get things in order, try to do an analysis of what's there. So for example, in astronomy, we've now sort of transformed this room a little bit. That shelf at the left has a ordering system. We're putting things there, and hopefully by the time we're, you know, done, if you ever can be done with this room, it'll look like a pretty well-ordered system. And so we know what's there. And in our records, so we know what's there for our own records, and you know what's there just when you walk in the room. The point of this entire collection, oh, by the way, before I go on to the online catalog, I should just sort of show you what a room looks like. This is the cataloging room. These are big rolling shelves that have an immense amount of storage space. We were very fortunate to be just sort of given at least control of half of this room with the promise that maybe the rest of it will eventually be ours in some later date. And these are to museum studies, or I guess Faculty of Information students doing cataloging. So you look at an item, you measure it, you describe what you see, you try to gain some information from the object, then put it into the online catalog, which is happening on the left with Jordan, and there's Natalie on the right. And we also photograph it. So we have a mini, you know, photography studio with the seamless backdrop, you know, strobe flashes, and the whole deal. And so we're really sort of making a concerted effort here to try to to preserve the objects and know where they are, either within our own storage space, within others, and sort of get as much as we can from them online. So the whole point of this is to make a push for throwing things online. And I'm going to see if I can get on the internet here. Hopefully the internet gods will favor me. So our website is utsic.org. And right now, this is the interface we have right now. It's actually going to be changed. So if you come back to this in about a month, it'll look radically different, and I'll explain the reason for that afterwards. We have sort of an opening part here where we talk about, this is sort of our narrative overlay, where we sort of, you know, post things that we're sort of interested in, hopefully links that aren't dead. And the actual collection itself, go to browse. Whoops. So this is a typical entry. We sort of have a chronometer. It's an astronomical chronometer. We have dimensions, markings, maker, date of manufacture, etc. And we have a number of pictures which we've taken. And so you can do things like click on a picture, and it'll have a close-up of this. You can even magnify it to make it really big. Well, that's a little too big. So let's go back. And so the reason that we're changing this, aside from fixing things like obviously our search system problems, is to put in the capacity for an online museum, an online exhibits, because we want to throw up interesting displays of instruments like you're going to see afterwards, but they can't be there forever. And it's a lot easier to do virtual displays that correspond to conferences or whatnot than do you know, just permanent displays all the time. And so I think for the transit itself for June 5th, that's our sort of tentative deadline, we're going to try to have an online display of the physical display you see here. So if you give us your email addresses, I'll send you out some information when that comes out. So, you know, we'll sort of show you our new site and show you what we're working on. So that's the collection, and I think Paul, I should give this over to Paul right now to speak about some parts of the astronomy.
All right, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the actual experience of working with astronomy itself. And you can see here we put up one of the transit theodolites on the tripod just to get an idea of the kind of objects we have on display. I actually didn't put a do not touch sign on it, but I think everyone's pretty much got the idea with the red marker there. But so that you can have a look at that one later. I just wanted to show, again, the organizing committee. What is interesting is that we had this idea for doing the Transit of Venus event. Ari, I believe, came up with the idea at a conference in, was it Venice that you were in? Florence, sorry, Florence. And we were thinking, there's this big telescope in the Victoria College, and it's sort of, we always say, this telescope was used for the Transit of Venus. And it's like, wait a second, the Transit of Venus is coming up in 2012. We should actually do an exhibit of instruments that are associated with or were actually used in viewing the transit of Venus of the 19th century, especially with this telescope perhaps being the primary piece. And that led to contacts with astronomy. We also were in contact with David Pantaloni from the Scientific Museum of Science in Ottawa, because he had been one of the actual earlier grad students, I think, who worked with this collection. And he was concerned to locate or to know what had happened to some of the valuable astronomy instruments, which he had actually worked with before. So that led to contacts within the astronomy department. And I just have the organizing committee here. We have a few of the people you've already met. Randall, you have met, and Erich and Ari are there. John Percy has been very helpful in coordinating a lot of the astronomy side of this partnership. Michael Reed as well. Lee Robbins is the librarian. She has been very helpful in actually identifying the locations of some of the instruments that we were looking for. And this led to actually thinking through maybe we should do a symposium and come together and bring this event about. And what I really enjoy about this is exactly an example of the interdisciplinary goals for the UTSIC of partnering with science departments, connecting the history of science with the current work in the science, and all focused, I guess, around instrumentation. So what I want to go through then is actually give you a few snapshots of some of the instruments that we found. And you'll also be seeing them when we lead a tour to the exhibit itself, which is in Victoria College, because that's where the Institute of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology is housed. So when we take you to that exhibit, you should be able to see them in their exhibit space. But here is one instrument. This was actually the first instrument. When we went down to that basement room, Lee was very excited about this instrument and wanted to show it off to us. And you will see it today. It's on display. It's a beautiful 18th century sundial, equinoctial ring. And you can almost see the kind of the filigree, and I always imagine it as a kind of a Baroque or Rococo kind of style. What's interesting to me is how much effort has gone into crafting this instrument and making it look not only is it functional and precise, but it's also beautifully made. And these little dials on the bottom can turn the whole thing, there's this whole gear system underneath it. And what's intriguing to me is that when you look at an instrument and you investigate not only the functionality that is built into it, but also the I guess the attention to detail and beauty that they want to put in it. It tells you something of the interaction between the culture and the instrument at the time. And I always ask a question, what do our current instruments say about our own society compared to perhaps past instruments saying about their society, and the relation between culture and scientific practice? It's just an interesting, what are our values that come out of even looking at our instruments. And here I just have a close-up. You can see all along the one side of the ring, they give us some helpful information regarding latitudes. So here you Amsterdam, Petersburg. They also, further up, they have Constantinople, which wasn't really Constantinople anymore at this time, but they were still referring to it as Constantinople. And so it's basically a number of different latitudes which can allow you to align the sundial for the angle of the sun. And I think over here we have some calendar indications so that you can know exactly what time of year you are. So when you're making your time measurement, you coordinate it according to both latitude and day of the year, so you can take an accurate time measurement. This, of course, was replaced by chronometers, but this one it's interesting. It's a 1763, I believe, is the date for this one. The next one I want to show you is a Gregorian reflector. These actually came out in Randall's talk. These were the actual telescopes that were used in the 1761 and 1769 transits. And this is, I think, personally, this is probably my favorite piece in the collection. This one comes a little bit later. It's about early 1800s was the date of manufacture. But we can see the Gregorian reflector. And I think I have another few shots of this one. So Bain, London, very important information, who's the manufacturer. And I want to just show, if you look, this is looking down inside. And if you can see, this piece here is actually the primary mirror. So the light is coming in here. And then here's a secondary mirror that reflects to it. So light comes in, reflects to this one, and goes down to this hole, which is where the actual eyepiece is. And what's interesting is the Gregorian reflector, by doing that, it allows it to extend its focal length without, so if you see you might think this is a kind of short telescope, but it's actually extending the focal length by having this operation. Of course, you also have this spot in the middle of your viewing. It's called a Gregorian reflector because it was designed by James Gregory, a Scotsman. It was only successfully constructed by Robert Hooke in 1673. I think one other thing that is useful with this telescope is you can have a kind of field stop, I believe, that diminishes the amount of light that's coming to the secondary mirror. And what that does is when you're doing observations, for example, of the sun, it can reduce the amount of heat that is being collected. So it's ideal for actually solar measurements. I want to move on to another instrument. This is the Gregorian, this one. This actually has nothing to do with the transit of Venus, but this is an example of some of the beautiful instruments we found in the collection. It's a ICA camera from about 1916. ICA was a German company based in Dresden, and they made some of these cameras. This actually belonged to Chant, and there's a poster I have in the exhibit if you want to look at that. He was one of the early members of, I think he was almost the founding member of the astronomy department here at U of T, and very influential in astronomy in Canada. So it was nice to see a few personal items of Chance. We have this, and we have some field binoculars, so you can have a look at it. It's a beautiful camera, and here's actually when it's closed up. Fits in here. It's about so big. You can actually fit it in your vest pocket. It's similar to a style called the vest pocket Kodak camera. And what I find intriguing is I was doing some research on it, and there's this little piece in the back. So this is the film. You can actually slide this little bit down here, and it's got a kind of a red filter on it, and you can scratch directly onto the film. You can make a little date or a little marking. So as you take a picture, honestly, if you imagine, remember in the 90s they had a little thing that give you the date? Well, you can do that here. You just flip that in 1960 and put the date on the film as you take your picture. So in some ways, this is one of the early portable cameras. And although it's not directly related to the transit, I found it a fascinating piece, and it is related to the history of astronomy at the University of Toronto and in Canada. So it's a kind of a nice bridge piece from then to now. This one, does anybody know what this is? Does this look familiar at all? This is the back of it. It's got a little, this is screwed right here, screw piece here.
It's like some kind of device for differential astrometry, I would guess. Are prisms in it?
No, there are no prisms in it. But that would be a good guess. These here, these are little micrometer dials. This is actually, when I saw this, I had no clue. I said, this is a nice, fancy instrument. What was nice is the box actually had a little label on it that said micrometer screw. I said, okay, that's nice. These are micrometer screws. That doesn't tell me enough about what the instrument is. It's actually what's called a filar micrometer. And it's filar because it's from Latin for the wire. And what you do is, I did not realize this when I first was handling the piece. And it was quite, I blogged about this on the UT site. I'm quite grateful for the museum studies people who taught us to be very cautious with these instruments, because if you look inside here, it's hard to tell, but there are two very delicate threads. Do you see this one here? And another one here. These are made out of spider silk. And so this is exceptionally fine-tuned. I'm very grateful I wasn't like, oh, cobwebs, you know. So no, we are taking care of these instruments. We have been properly instructed, and we're doing research on them. But these threads, those micrometer screws on the side, you turn them and they actually move the threads by micrometers. And what you're doing is you're putting this on top of your telescope, and there's a small viewfinder through here, and you can tell very precise stellar distances through by aligning the threads to what you're observing. Yeah, I think they use it for binary stars especially. So this is us. The reason I have this picture is because, quite frankly, we haven't been able to get a very nice picture of the main telescope. So ignore us. And there! Because it's so big, and actually it's stuck in this box, which apparently doesn't even have a door. So that telescope is never moving. But you will be seeing it. It's the main centerpiece of our exhibit. I'm going to move on to a picture that doesn't have us in it. Oh, there we go. This is a catalog image for it from Beck. And this is it's a Beck telescope. I think it's 4 1/4 inch telescope. What's our time? I'm supposed to keep my own time, right? This telescope is sort of the centerpiece. What is interesting about this telescope, it was used by Professor Abraham Bain to record the transit of Venus in 1882, December 6th, 1882. And what I really enjoyed about learning about this telescope was it had an entire history. It was purchased in 1874 in England and was transported to Victoria College, which at that point was in Coburg. Victoria only moved to the University of Toronto in 1892. And this telescope was purchased there. But I read some clippings from the Acta Victoriana, which is a kind of a school, at that point it was more of a school newspaper. You had some editorial letters that came through. And it seems that, well, before that, I want to give a quote from the Coburg Sentinel. So when they received it, the telescope arrived last week. It has been mounted, and it can be seen at the residences of Professor Bain. So he was only an MA at that point, but he was still a professor of mathematics and astronomy at Coburg. It is of great power and could be bought in New York for less than $1,800, which was a fairly substantial amount of money at that time, just to give you an idea. However, we see a little bit later, in 1879, that they're wanting to move it. So here is, owing to the kindness of Bain, the senior class this year are going to enjoy the benefit of stargazing. This is excellent. We now get to enjoy it. It's a high prestige item, this telescope. So they definitely want to have a look through it. They're thinking, this is our telescope. We want to see it. And it'll be placed either in the tower constructed for it or on the campus. So it was first put in Bain's residence because the Faraday Hall was not ready. It was constructed, I think it was completed, Faraday Hall at Coburg was completed in 1878. So now they have it built, but they need to pay some money for the mounting of it. However, a year later, it will be remembered that some 2.5 years ago, the class of 77 offered the faculty the sum of $150, so they raised some money for the mounting, for the proper mounting of this telescope. Yet, we're exceedingly sorry that this step has been delayed so long. It certainly does seem more than strange that so valuable an instrument should be permitted to lie unused for so long a period. And in the same article, in the same edition actually, there's another article that's a little bit more upset. And why is it that while Victoria University is perhaps the best telescope in the Dominion and has had it for 4 years, no class has yet had any benefit from it? So the students think this telescope is for us to look at stargazing. It is for our instruction in science and what's going on here. Well, I looked a little bit and I found out what was going on. There's some necessary what they call clockwork. So you've got to align it correctly to be able to take proper measurements, which I think the student body might not correctly appreciate. And so this is an article explaining what's going on. So they've gone to Clark, the famous instrument maker of Boston, and he was correspondent with it, but he already had other commitments, so sorry, can't help you. Now look at the date, 1880. So if he needs 3 years, we're in trouble, right? Because the transit is coming up in 2 years. So Professor Bain made personal visits to Toronto, Washington, and New York. He could find no one who could undertake it. I imagine Bain is a little bit worried by this point, because he is, I'm sure, quite aware of the transit coming up, and this is perhaps why the telescope even was purchased. I can't say for sure. There's not a record necessarily of the rationale. But finally, he, by dint of persuasion, the dint of hard persuasion, he induced Mr. Clark to promise that he would make the clock work and set up the telescope. So as soon as he was finished with his current work. I'm not sure exactly how Professor Bain persuaded him, but he did. However, it seems like it got quite late, because we look here from November '82. The students are still complaining. This is a senior writing. No, this is a sophomore writing, and he thinks every year it's been announced this valuable telescope, the gift of et cetera, was placed in an observatory tower with a rotating turret. But senior class after senior class has gone out of college mourning the deprivation of the pleasure of stargazing. And we suppose that we shall receive our sheepskins and never have looked through our telescope. And he emphasizes it's our telescope. So there's a sense of ownership. Victoria and telescope go together. And here's Faraday Hall. So this was the original Victoria College, and this was Faraday Hall built for science education. And there we can see the rotating turret that the telescope was eventually placed in. However, by December 6th, 1882, it has been placed, the clockwork has been installed, and Professor Bain was able to make very important observations from that tower. In fact, Coburg was one of the major sites for the 1882 transit. And you can see his report in the Proceedings and Transactions of the Royal Society. I think this was in January that he wrote it. So this is just an example of the report. He talks when internal contact at egress, this time at the observatory, and the clouds swept by. You can see the weather problems, but then we also see beautifully distinct light line that surrounded a portion of the planet's limb. So he has a clear observation at that point. And I just wanted to point out the chronometer is here, and he's describing the time of the Toronto Observatory. These are two of the chronometers from the collection. I'm not entirely sure if these were present at that time, but they seem to be that time period. So these may well have been the actual timekeepers for the Toronto Standard Time of those observations. And that's it that I have for here. One thing I wanted to point out, specifically with the story of the Victoria telescope, that I find quite fascinating, is that here we see an instrument in a culture interacting with other instruments and having its own story, having newspaper articles written about it, and doing science. It's almost as if when we think of the history of science, we can write history of science perhaps from the perspective even of instruments, rather than necessarily the perspective of scientists. And this Victoria College telescope has a personality, it has a history, it has an interaction. And that's an intriguing idea to me, the history of science from the perspective of the instruments that are actually doing these observations. So I think I went a little bit over time. I apologize for that. But we are going to break for lunch. Yes, questions?
Well, this is wonderful, and very clear, at the end, you show a very clear observation of something I'm going to talk about this afternoon, the atmosphere beyond. But there are questions that I'll also talk about what Lomonosov might have seen, which we heard about a little bit before, and what could have been seen with the telescopes. So, so I'm jealous you have this nice website, but I really want you to take those two telescopes you showed out to see the transit of Venus.
Ooh.
Let's talk intensely about that, and there are certainly qualified members of the RASC who can work on these things.
Well, I'm sure we can talk about it.
And we would like to know.
They're not my instruments. They're the astronomy department's instruments.
You've got a transit and you've got a telescope.
You might need a crane. You can only get into that case you saw through the top.
Well, it can be lifted out, and the small one would certainly be easy.
Yeah, the small one's easy to take.
So
the Gregorian
the
reflector.
Telescope, we really would like to see some observations with that. And there are a lot of people taking some old telescopes. Mount Wilson, for example, where there's an organized try to use the old telescopes to see what.
Really, to see how they, to make an observation. Okay, that's excellent. Yeah, I think I'm not the one who's in charge of these. We're curating or recording them, but they do belong to the astronomy department, so that would be their call, I think. what we have on our program now, are there any urgent questions, I guess? I think we should continue with the program. What we have right now is a tour of the astronomical exhibit. So what I've shown you, we actually